Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this next part of The Coming of Civilization, a history book that is now over 50 years old, as you can no doubt tell from this worn spine, but gives us a fascinating look into the peoples and cultures of different eras throughout history. So this part we start with the Hittites, who are a warlike tribe about whom very little is known. Their iron swords and strict code of law dominated the Middle East for 300 years. So here we have the Hittite Empire, which was centered on Anatolia, flourished from 1500 to 1200 BC, with its capital at Hattusas. The map shows these important places in Hittite times. There's Carchemish, which was later the capital. And here is a Hittite bas-relief showing a hunting scene. The Hittites excelled in hunting. So about the time of Hammurabi, who we saw in the previous part of the Babylonians, the Hittites, an Indo-Aryan people who came from the north across the Caucasus Mountains, were establishing themselves in Anatolia, northwest of Babylonia. Their land had a harsher climate than Mesopotamia, and it was more like that of the Russian steppe. Winters brought biting winds and heavy snow, but the summer sun scorched vegetation. Sounds very hard, so the Hittites settled in the milder river valleys and unified the isolated city communities of Anatolia and imposed their own system of order on them. So around 1600 BC, the Hittites had set up their capital at Hattusas. Shortly after, they conquered northern Syria and raided Babylon. Few armies could withstand the Hittite onslaught. They fought with weapons that no one else could match: iron swords. So although they dominated the Middle East between 1500 and 1200 BC, we know very little about them. So they developed a code of laws similar to Hammurabi's, but it was less harsh. The death penalty was imposed less frequently. They paid more attention to putting matters right after an offence and placed less emphasis on punishment. Sounds quite progressive. The Hittite kings commanded the army, and were chief judges and high priests. And after death and cremation, they were worshipped as gods. The early kings had constantly to guard their positions against jealous nobles seeking to usurp their throne, and Hittite queens had a degree of power and importance which was rare in the ancient world. So the stormy climate of Anatolia gave rise to the weather god, who took many forms. In mythology, the weather god was beaten in combat by an evil dragon, and later, with the help of the goddess Inaras and a human, the weather god slew his enemy. The Hittites shared with the Hurrians the storm god Teshub, whose wife Hebat, and the winged goddess Shaushka. The cella, the holiest part of Hittite temples, was approached through two small rooms, and the weather god stood at the end of the dark cella, brilliantly lit by the light of two windows, one either side of him. And the art of the Hittites was less refined than that of their neighbours, and featured crudely carved stone lions. Hattusas contained cuneiform writing in several languages, and the Hittites also used hieroglyphics. So the Hittite farmers had the advantage of iron ploughshares in tilling their thin but fertile soil, and staple crops included barley and emmer wheat, vine and olives. Bronze was by far the most common metal. The Hittites became the great iron masters, capable of defeating most enemies, and their standing army probably included foreign mercenaries and units supplied by vassals of the king. The speedy Hittite horse-drawn war chariots carried 3 soldiers, while the Egyptians carried 2. So it's very interesting that we know little about them, despite the fact that they were quite technologically advanced for the time. And it's interesting that they decided not to spread much further than they already were, despite their technological advantage. They arrived in Anatolia about 2000 BC, conquered the Hattans, absorbed the Hurrians, and spread through Anatolia and northern Syria. Around 1530 BC, King Marsilis I sacked Babylon rulers founded the indecisive Battle of Kadesh against Pharaoh Ramses II. Soon after this, danger fled in the Western Empire. The vassal kingdoms revolted, and Aegean peoples, fleeing from the rising power of the Greeks, invaded by land and sea. By 1200 BC, they burned, Adusis and Hittite power waned. Okay, well that will explain it then, won't it? Carchemish became the eastern capital of a federation of weak Hittite states that survived for another 500 years. And in 717 BC, Carchemish fell to new warlords, the Assyrians, and the Hittites disappeared as a distinct people. Here they are as a warlike people from the harsher climate of the north, very stripped back, as you can see. This brings us on to the Phoenicians, called the Red Blood, or Blood Red Men by those who feared them. They were the greatest mariners of their time, and their cunning made them excellent pirates, mercenaries, and merchants. Their intelligence shaped our present-day alphabet. That's interesting. So although their own land was small, it's just this tiny little coastal region here, just north of Palestine. Phoenician seamen and colonizers dominated the Mediterranean sea routes, and their ships sailed as far north as Britain and south to Africa, which opened up new trade routes and established colonies along the Mediterranean coast. Settlements were founded in Carthage, Cadiz, Ibiza, Cyprus, and Rhodes. Here are the rather beautiful-looking cedars of Lebanon that are now few in number but supplied merchant fleets of the great powers of the Middle East. According to the Bible, 80,000 men took several years to cut and shape cedar wood for King Solomon's temple. And here are round ships, beached while dockers at the time unload jars, sacks, timber, other exports. Pack mules will then carry these goods directly to the importer, and they thrived on trade. They exported purple cloth, glassware, and a whole range of goods manufactured from imported materials. So sometime after 3000 BC, a people known in the Bible as the Canaanites moved into the narrow coastal strip between Anatolia and Palestine. And more than any other people, they were merchants and sea-going traders. So we know them now by their Greek name, Phoenicians. The land was fertile but tiny, and great powers blocked territorial expansion. But of course the sea was rich in fish, and the Phoenicians first put to sea to feed an expanding population. Their prosperity lay in the waters that surrounded their lands. They're the greatest mariners of their time. Ships visited every part of the Mediterranean coast, probably sailed north into the Atlantic as far as the Tin Isles of Britain, and south to the western coast of Africa. Their homeland possessed good natural harbours, and they developed these into fortified city-state ports. Their leading bases were Sidon and Tyre, and other ports included Byblos, Beirut, and Aradus. So the name Phoenicia may have come from the Greek word phoinos, blood red. The Greeks would have had two good reasons for calling the Canaanite sailors red men. So one was their ruddy, seafaring complexions. The other was that the clothing and skin of the seamen often bore traces of the red-purple dye known as Tyrian purple. So this dye was highly prized by the rich throughout the ancient world and was obtained from a shellfish called murex and produced by secret processes in Sidon and Tyre. The murex secreted the dye only when dead and decaying, so the smell from Sidon and Tyre must have been sickening. Oh yeah, could you imagine? Phoenicia never unified. It was just a group of allied but independent city-states ruled by merchant kings who avoided war on land but pursued piracy at sea. So if trade declined because of war, Phoenician sailors hired themselves out as shippers or mercenaries. No warrior king or heavy-handed central government oppressed the Phoenicians, and freebooting and free enterprise were the lifeblood of their culture, prime exports being cedar and pine wood. And none rivaled the Phoenicians at business. Many envied them. They developed a speedy alphabetical script to keep business records, and accounts were designed and their cities as fortified business centres instead of trying to rival the splendours of Egypt and Babylonia. Very efficient peoples. Their deities were closely connected with those of neighbouring countries. Many were nature gods, so Baalat, the Lady of Byblos, resembled the Egyptian goddess Hathor, fertility of the land, although he lived by the sea. His rival was an even greater god, Baal, which in Semitic languages had a generalized meaning, and there were as many Baals as there were religious centers. Baal worship was especially repugnant to the Hebrews who settled in South Canaan, the land of the purple. So around 1600 BC, they realized that all languages used no more than about 30 sounds. So for each of 22 sounds, they drew a symbol or letter. These 22 letters formed the first alphabet. Since then, most of the world, excluding China and Japan, has developed alphabetic languages derived from the Phoenician. The arts and crafts of Phoenicia had a commercial base, so imported ivory, gold, silver, ebony, silk and precious stones were deftly worked into luxuries for export. Phoenicians manufactured exports, including jewellery, Tyrian purple cloth, fine linen, furniture, embroideries, metalwork, faience and glass. They were probably the main inventors of glass and the technique of glass blowing. Here's a fertility goddess, which figured prominently in the religion of the Phoenicians and their neighbours. So it was taken to Carthage. The Phoenician religion became barbarously bloodthirsty. The shekel, a piece of gold or silver weighing about 14 grams that circulated as money, later became a coin. So the Phoenicians developed their city-states over a long period of time, 2900 to 1500 BC, and stood at the crossroads of several great powers, and usually had to acknowledge the overlordship of one or more of them. The struggles between the Hittites and the Egyptians especially threatened their welfare, so by the 1300 BCs the Phoenician cities found it expedient to divide their loyalties between two great powers. So when Egypt's power waned about 920 BC, the Phoenician cities began a period of real independence lasting about 2 generations. But in 868 BC, a new military power, Assyria, advanced into the Mediterranean and forced the Phoenicians to pay tribute. When Assyria fell in 612 BC, Phoenicia became a pawn in a power struggle between Chaldean Babylonia and Egypt. And in 538 BC, Phoenicia passed under the control of Persia. But again, the Phoenicians brought survival by redirecting their loyalties to the new overlords. Very politically savvy people. So Assyria's bureaucratic rule was irksome to the enterprising Phoenicians, and it encouraged more of them to settle in colonies abroad. So according to Phoenician tradition, Dido, a princess of Tyre, led a migration to northwest Africa in 814 BC. There, near modern Tunis, she founded a new capital, also known as Carthage, and is said to have gained the land by a trick. And as time passed, Carthage grew stronger than the homeland had ever been, and the Carthaginians built an outer harbour to shelter their commercial ships and an inner harbour as a base for their warships. A tall naval tower was built on an island in the inner harbour, and from its heights lookouts kept a constant watch against the approach of enemy vessels or spy ships. All ships that entered the fortified harbour through a 22 metres wide gap could be securely closed by heavy chains. So by 500 BC, the city held some 200,000 people. Its African hinterland spread to take in 50,000 square kilometres and another 500,000 people. Like their forebears, the Carthaginians continued to excel as manufacturers, traders and shippers, pirates and colonists. They added Sicily and much of Spain to their empire. And in changing times, the bloodthirsty Carthaginian religion was despised by other Mediterranean peoples. Uncaring, the Carthaginians continued to sacrifice the children of nobles to appease their horned sky god, Baal Hamon, and worshippers sought his favours by practicing self-mutilation before him. Other Mediterranean peoples had long abandoned such practices. So I believe this is discussed in a little bit more detail in the ancient mysteries of the 70 ancient mysteries of civilizations, or 70 mysteries of ancient civilization series. So the chief rivals at sea for the Phoenicians had been the Greeks, and from them the Carthaginians had little to fear. By 348 BC, a more formidable power was rising across the Mediterranean, Rome, and in that year Carthage concluded an advantageous treaty with Rome. The uneasy peace lasted for 84 years until war came between the two powers over a dispute in Sicily. The Romans then fought 3 Punic Wars, the Carthaginian Wars, Rome's final triumph was absolute, and Carthage disappeared from history and became the Roman province of Africa. And we are now led on to the Assyrians, the all-conquering Assyrians, who were the supreme masters of war and the most cruel race of their time. Yet their interest in culture was profound. It's largely due to them that we know so much about the ancient world today. So this map shows the empire of Assyria, which absorbed all of its neighbours between 880 and 626 BC. The Assyrians fell like a wolf on the fold before they in turn finally succumbed to the Medes and Persians. Here is Ashurnasirpal II believed that he had a divine right to hunt wild animals and employed hunting dogs to aid in these lavish pursuits. So one of the great Mesopotamian civilizations, Assyria, was centered on the Tigris River north of Babylon. At first its capital was Ashur, later Nineveh, and the Assyrians had less fertile land than the Sumerians and Babylonians, and consequently there was pressure on them to expand their territory as their population increased. But whenever they tried to push back their borders, they were repulsed by powerful neighbours such as the Hittites and Babylonians. So the Assyrians had to become a warrior people to survive. All men were conscripted into the army. They attacked, defeated, and often annexed neighbouring countries, so created a vast empire, and in the process became the supreme masters of the art and science of war. They excelled at siegecraft, and their special techniques included the use of speedy chariots, from which archers shot arrows with deadly accuracy. Like the Hittites, they had weapons of iron, not bronze, and the Assyrians have left us a permanent record of their battles carved in stone on the walls of their splendid palaces. They gained a reputation for cruelty. It was said that they skinned their victims alive, impaled or burned them to death. Oh dear. Possibly they exaggerated the extent of their cruelty to discourage resistance, or their enemies overstated the case for propaganda purposes, which is probably more likely, right? The Assyrian astronomers used a circular clay instrument in making calculations, inscribed with forecasts derived from their observations of the moon. That's very clever. Here's the king again who began Assyria's conquests, relaxing from war by hunting lions. Not my first choice for R&R, but this relief from Nimrod is one of the many in museums on which the Assyrians recorded in detail their vigorous activities on war and peace. Here's a deer running headlong into a trap. So the Assyrians weren't just soldiers, they had a great respect for the culture of the peoples they conquered. Now when they seized a city, they preserved its library, and their scribes translated the information they found there into the Assyrian language, where necessary, so it could be put to practical use. The library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh was particularly impressive, arranged into sections such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, religion and history. So in Assyria, all land was the king's in theory, and to a large extent, in fact, much of it was given by him to government officials and veteran soldiers as a reward for loyal service, but landholders had to pay taxes. They paid a 25% tax on grain, 10% on straw, and an unknown amount on livestock. They had to give money to their temples and pay water transport tolls. They could buy themselves out of militia service. Economic problems motivated some of the Syria's wars, so the Aramaeans, a group of freebooting nomadic tribes who occupied northern Syria between 1110 and 700 BC, raided and seized large areas of Mesopotamia. They cut the vital trade links with the Mediterranean coast, and the Assyrians pushed them back and brought the whole area westwards to the Mediterranean under their control. Sidon, Tyre, and other Phoenician cities became part of the Assyrian Empire. And unlike the easygoing Babylonians, the Assyrians brought most of the economy of the empire under state control, and Phoenician resistance to the levying of taxes was finally put down by Assyrian troops. Here is a Assyrian siege tower approaching the wall of a besieged city. And Assyrian engineers devised several kinds of assault machines, including battering rams. Assyrian archers are shooting their deadly arrows at the defenders from behind an improvised wickerwork shield. and heavy metal-fitted chariots of the Assyrians carried 3 men like the Hittite chariots, and the horses were vulnerable and startled. Horses could overturn a chariot, which caused chaos on the battlefield. This guy's vibing. So the gods and religious festivals of Assyria were closely allied to those of Sumeria and Babylonia. Most Assyrian myths, too, paralleled those of Babylon. Ashur, the city god of the capital Ashur, became the national god of the Assyrian Empire. Probably to promote loyalty from conquered peoples, Assyrian priests identified him with earlier Mesopotamian gods such as Enlil, and in the time of Sargon II, Ashur became identified with Anshar, the celestial world and parent of other gods. Under Sennacherib, Ashur became the counterpart of Marduk. It was the religious equivalent to the Assyrian state Ashur. The god, as god of the most warlike power in the Middle East, he was given detailed written reports by the kings outlining their military campaigns. When Ashur became Assyria's capital, about 1350 BC, a great period of ziggurat and temple building began. They continued until the fall of Nineveh, Nimrud and Khoshabad. Like the Babylonians, the Assyrians built splendid palaces with entrances flanked by human-headed winged bulls. The art of Assyria generally followed the pattern of Sumeria and Babylon, secular rather than religious, but the reliefs that covered the walls of the palaces were essentially Assyrian and depicted lifelike details of dress and weapons, horses and chariots. The Assyrians themselves are pictured as stocky, determined and woolly bearded. The reliefs confirm their inhumanity. So the Assyrian people represented only a fraction of the population of the empire, and they had to rely heavily on foreign manpower. A high proportion of their army and their workforce was therefore non-Assyrian. Labour in the homeland was scarce, considering the immense amount of building construction that was undertaken. Tens of thousands of prisoners of war and exiled peoples were taken in as forced labourers. From Samaria alone, which was the capital of Israel, 27,000 people were sent to Assyria as forced labourers. Wow. Payments of tax and tribute from conquered peoples went mainly to the upkeep of the army and to the cost of building, but Assyrian rule was not without benefits. The new order brought peace and prosperity in place of the perpetual petty wars of smaller states. Speedy communication between the chief Assyrian cities and provinces was vital to the existence of the empire, and to achieve this they constructed an imperial road system with relay stations and guard posts. The status given to conquered provinces depended largely upon the degree of cooperation they gave to Assyria. Some kept their own rulers but paid tribute. Others, although they were allowed to keep their own ruler, had an Assyrian advisor at court. Some had an Assyrian governor who ruled with absolute power. They were the contemporaries of Babylonians and Hittites, but their period of power only really began in the 800 BC. Read time. Ashurnasirpal II chased the Armenians westward to the Mediterranean and took the Phoenician cities. Tiglath-Pileser III extended the empire from the old Sumerian cities into Asia Minor and incorporated Palestine and Syria, and his armies threatened the borders of Egypt. Babylonia was left to the rule of its own kings so long as they followed Assyria's policies, and when the Chaldeans tried to seize control of Babylonia, Tiglath-Pileser III finally annexed it directly to Assyria. So in 721 BC, a military revolt placed Sargon II on the throne, and his dynasty too fought perpetual wars of expansion, conquering the Greek cities of Cyprus. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, defeated an alliance of Elamites, Babylonians and Chaldeans, and quelled an Egyptian-inspired revolt in Judea. Exasperated at Babylon's persistent opposition, Sennacherib devastated the splendid city, turning it into a wasteland. Even the city god Marduk was taken into captivity to Ashur. Sennacherib's sons murdered him, possibly because of the destruction of Babylon. One of them, Esarhaddon, rebuilt the city and restored Marduk to his temple. Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, was a scholar, but nevertheless he and his 2 sons, who followed him, had to fight the same dreary cycle of wars. And at this time Assyria's strength was beginning to wane. About 621 BC it came close to civil war. Nabopolassar, the Chaldean who seized the throne of Babylon in 625 BC, allied Babylon with Media, and soon after Nabopolassar Asa and Sarsares, the Median king, jointly attacked Assyria. Not all of Assyria's vassal states wanted it to fall. They feared that if Assyria collapsed, the Scythians, Cimmerians, and other nomads would sweep into the Middle East and destroy civilization. But their allies couldn't save it. In 612 BC, the Babylonians and Medes destroyed Nineveh, and it was never rebuilt. In 609 BC, Assyria ceased to exist. Here is, I think, quite a famous historic image of the winged bulls with human heads that guarded the gates of King Sargon's palace at Khorsabad. They had 5 legs so that 4 could be seen from the side and 2 from the front. It is terrifying, isn't it, how a civilization can just cease to exist and just disappear. How an entire civilization of peoples just vanishes. And I suppose on that positive note, we will put a pin in it for here, and I look forward to having you join me back next time for more Civilization.